There's a paradigm shift between our first conversation and our second, but not necessarily between our speakers, who are both fundamentally people who take their voice seriously. Our second speaker, Sarbpreet Singh, he's not based in the country, and we're very fortunate to be able to catch him on a whirlwind trip to India. Because while his career is in technology, his heart is clearly in art. He is a poet, a playwright, a commentator, an author. He is, of course, frequently written both in the Boston Herald, for NPR, and a host of other publications. He runs a very, very passionate project for the preservation of Sikh music, of Punjabi music and Sikh music. But it is, in fact, with this book called The Camel Merchants of Philadelphia, which traces the court of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, that we discover a very, very nuanced and complex take on a character who has shaped not just the history of the North, but in many ways inflected the history of this country. As we've often said, as it's always said about history, that without understanding where you came from, there is no way to go anywhere, forget know where you're going. So for that crucial conversation about Maharaja Ranjit Singh, about that court that inflected so much of this country's life, it is a pleasure to invite Sarbpreet Singh. And to have that conversation, it is an equal privilege for me to invite a veteran and celebrated journalist. He has been the editor of, he's been the business editor at India Today. He was the editor of INN, the news agency, and he was editor of Business Standard. It is my privilege to host this conversation, Hardev Sanotra.
Oh boy, that's going to be difficult now. After that scintillating performance, to bring your interest into history is going to be a little difficult.
He thinks it's going to be difficult.
But if anybody can do it, Sarbpreet can do it. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm the one who's sweating, and he says...
Okay, why Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the man who really came from a small principality and made the largest empire in Indian history, so to say? Why did you get your interest in him, and how did you? Because Sarbpreet grew up actually in Sikkim, where his knowledge or relation with Sikhism was very tenuous. He really got the interest when he went to America for his graduate studies. But he'll tell us more about it and how he got interested and about the man he wrote about.
Sure, I'll be happy to talk about that. So I left India to go to graduate school in the US when I was about 24. Yes, of course, happy to do that. I hate talking with a mic in my hand, but we don't have a choice. You know, when we go away from our roots, most of us start seeking them, paradoxically. And I was no different. Everyone's journey is unique. Mine was informed by history more than anything else. And I stumbled upon this quite serendipitously. So if you'll humor a small digression, I'll tell you a story. So I'm this young man, 24 years old. I'm visiting my aunt in California. I look like a Sikh, but my connection to my faith, my religion, my history is almost non-existent. And in my aunt's house, there's a religious function going on, and I see a somewhat odd sight. There's a middle-aged man and his wife. They have both turbans on their heads, and their teenage daughters are sitting with them, and they're singing, and they're clearly having a great time. What's odd is that they're all Caucasian. I had never seen white Sikhs before. And there they were, you know, reading from Gurmukhi and singing. And after it was done, I was kind of scratching my head a little and went up to this man and asked him, you know, tell me about yourself. Who are you? Well, turns out, in his previous life, this man's name was Vic Briggs. He came from a blue-collar family in England, and he had been the lead guitarist of the band The Animals, which I was a huge fan of in those days. So I was pretty shocked, and you know, it was interesting to me that somebody with roots that were so far removed from mine was so much more connected with this faith, this community, and this culture than I was. So it was a bit of an eye-opener. So when I went back to university, I stumbled upon a book written by an Englishman. I think he was technically an Irishman, not an Englishman, J.D. Cunningham, who served the East India Company in the final days of the Sikh Empire. So J.D. Cunningham was the first writer, the first English writer to write a comprehensive history of the Sikhs. And that's when my journey to Ranjit Singh started. His book was absolutely fascinating, and particularly compelling was the story of the romance and tragedy of Ranjit Singh's empire as he told it. So that was what sparked my interest. Fast forward a few years later, I'm now living in New Jersey. I'm teaching young children at our Gurdwara Sunday school. And then I moved to Boston a few years later, and I continue doing that. So history can be a very dry subject. And I would always try to find ways of making it interesting for my kids. One of the thoughts that I had was that maybe if I created a little play and had the kids in my history class act in them, that might engage them. So that's what prompted me to do a little more digging into the life and court of Ranjit Singh, and I wrote a Punjabi play called Sarkar, which we cast with students from my history class, performed before a large audience. It was a tremendous amount of fun. And I'll tell you that all those kids are now grown up, including my own, and they've probably forgotten everything they learned in my history class except what they learned through the play. So that was my introduction to Ranjit Singh. And then that triggered a deeper interest, and I started looking for sources, and I found a plethora of them. The official diarist of Ranjit Singh was called Sohanlal Suri, and he wrote in Persian, which I don't read or write, unfortunately. But fortunately for me, his account of the court, called the Umdat wa Tarikh, was translated into English, and I had this treasure trove which talked about life in the court. And then, of course, in those times, in the early 1800s in particular, Ranjit Singh's court was visited by missionaries, doctors, Englishmen from the East India Company, a whole range of travelers who left very, very rich accounts, which were a gold mine of information about the kingdom. So all of that came together and resulted in the Camel Merchant of Philadelphia.
Yeah, perhaps you can give us, for the sake of our audience, quick brush strokes of what Maharaja Ranjit Singh was, how he grew into an emperor, which the Sikh today remember him as the greatest emperor.
Well, I'll try to do it concisely so that I don't put you to sleep. This is, after all, history.
But perhaps a quick one.
So we go back to 1739. The Mughal Empire was past its peak, and on the throne of Delhi sat Muhammad Shah Rangile, who was a patron of the arts, particularly music. The court was opulent, the court was decadent, but the court was not very powerful. That was the time when India was attacked by Nadir Shah of Persia, and his attack precipitated a steep decline in the fortunes of the Mughal Empire. Now, it's important to understand that Punjab was, of course, a part of the Mughal Empire. It was ruled by provincial governors who essentially reported to the Mughal emperors. So Nadir Shah's attack on Delhi, and then subsequent attacks by his lieutenant, Ahmad Shah Durrani, who seized power after Nadir Shah's death in Afghanistan, or Khorasan, and created the modern kingdom of Afghanistan. Repeated attacks by Ahmad Shah Durrani weakened Mughal control over the Punjab and created a power vacuum. Now, it's interesting that the Sikhs had been relentlessly oppressed by the Mughal governors in those times. In fact, in 1739, the Mughal governor of Lahore, Zakaria Khan, put a price on every Sikh's head. So if you brought a Sikh in, dead or alive, you would be rewarded richly. So it was a very tough time. But it was also a crucible in which perhaps the character of the Sikhs was forged, because what happened in the next few decades was that as Mughal control of Punjab crumbled, Sikhs started growing in power and organized themselves into these 12 de facto fiefdoms or bands called misls. So 12 misls ruled the Punjab, not officially, but they were the ones who wielded power. They would often jockey with each other for power, for territory, but whenever there was an external threat, such as an Afghan invasion, they would all come together and face them. Ranjit Singh was a scion of the Shukar Chakia misl or clan, which was one of the smallest and probably the weakest of the 12 misls. Aided by his mother-in-law, Mata Sada Kaur, who was a formidable woman, and she came from an opposing misl called the Kanhaiya misl, together they were slowly able to consolidate power, in some cases by fighting against the other fiefdoms, in other cases allying with them. And the net result was that this young man, at the age of 20, found himself the emperor of Lahore, right at the turn of the century, in no small part because of the encouragement and the vision of his mother-in-law, who was a formidable woman by all counts. So that was kind of how the empire came into being.
Yeah, in your book you have talked about Sada Kaur a lot. In fact, historians have not done justice to her about the role she played in bringing about the empire. Perhaps you could elaborate the role of the woman in Ranjit Singh's time.
Absolutely. So, after my book was published, I was talking to a friend in the US who writes about women, and she asked me a very interesting question. She said, well, your book talks about the sons of Ranjit Singh. Ranjit Singh had many wives and many concubines, and consequently many children. Surely he must have had some daughters too. Does anybody talk about them? And, I was struck by the fact that in all of my research, I have not found one reference to a daughter, not even a name. And, this sounds very odd, but really it was an artifact of the times, because in those days, think about it, the writers were the official court biographer, who would probably have his head chopped off if he tried to write about the king's daughters. And then, of course, you had all of these foreign visitors, who were exposed to a very small part of the court, and certainly not the harem. So as a result of that, and because of the fact that we've always been a patriarchal society, there really has been no focus on certainly the family, the king's daughters, and of course the other very powerful women who strode through history in those times. We are fortunate to know about a couple of them, and Sada Kaur was one of them. She had a very interesting history. She was married into the Kanhaiya misl, or confederacy, which was one of the most powerful, but her fortunes took a nosedive when her husband was killed in battle by none other than Ranjit Singh's father. So this woman, recognizing potential in Ranjit Singh, essentially swallowed a bitter pill and decided to betroth her daughter to Ranjit Singh, which was, quite extraordinary because his father had killed her husband. But she saw the potential in this young man. She nurtured him. There was this epiphany when the grandson of Ahmad Shah Abdali, Shah Zaman, wanted to reestablish his hold over the Punjab, and he decided to invade. Now, the Sikhs, at that time, pretty much invented the art of guerrilla warfare. Their tactics would be called Dai Fat in Punjabi, which means 2.5 attacks. So they would attack, they would retreat, they would draw the enemy, and when the enemy fell into their trap, they would attack them again. That's how they fought. And the reason was that their army was small. It was mobile, but small, and the Afghan army was huge. So typically what would happen is, every time the Afghans appeared, the Sikhs would retreat into the forests, into the hills, into the deserts to hide, and then they would harry the Afghans when they were on their way back. At the time of Shah Zaman's invasion, this is tenuously captured in history. The Sikhs had a tradition of meeting at the Sri Harmandir Sahib whenever there was an important event to be considered or an important decision to be made. So this event is called the Sarbat Khalsa, and it's actually happened a few times in modern times as well. It literally means all the Sikhs or all the Khalsas. So since the community was very Republican in its outlook, everyone would be invited and everyone would be welcome to speak. People would offer their opinion, then a decision would be made, and then it would be announced and it would be implemented. So the Sarbat Khalsa was on the cusp of deciding that once again it was time to retreat and flee when Sada Kaur stood up. Sada Kaur stood up in a time when women were not supposed to be heard and essentially challenged all the chiefs or sardars and said, we have been running from the Afghans for generations and they just keep coming back, taking what they want. When are we going to put a stop to this? There was a lot of opposition. The two most important missiles, the Bhangi missile and the Fulkia missile, which later on became the state of Patiala, were bitterly opposed. But Sada Kaur had such a magnetic personality that when she got up and spoke, she was able to carry the day. And it was decided that her young son-in-law would lead a combined force of Sikhs and they would take on the Afghans. And that was the first time that the Sikhs confronted the Afghans head on. And that was the start of the legend of Ranjit Singh. In subsequent campaigns, Sada Kaur actively participated. When Ranjit Singh took Lahore, because Lahore was under the command of the Bhangi missile, which was rather corrupt, Sada Kaur was directly involved in the battle. She helped him conquer the city, and then she was instrumental in having him anointed the Emperor of Lahore. So that was her contribution.
One of your chapters, you talked about his wives and concubines. Of course, yes. Maharajas and Rajas were known to keep a harem. But Ranjit Singh did marry a courtesan, and that brought in the wrath of Akal Takht on him. Indeed. Perhaps you could tell our audience why he did so and how it happened.
So that's one of the most colorful stories in the book. So as a young man, Ranjit Singh, of course, had a roving eye, and his eye fell upon a young Tawaif from Lahore whose name was Mora. So Ranjit Singh had to have her. So before I tell you about the wrath of the Akalis, I have to tell you this story that I discovered, written by one of the descendants of Ranjit Singh's personal physician and essentially his foreign minister, Fakir Azizuddin. So this story comes from the family chronicles of the Fakir family, which, by the way, to this day runs a museum in Lahore dedicated to Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So Ranjit Singh fell in love with this young courtesan, wanted to bring her into his harem, and one would think that her family would be thrilled. You know, after all, this is the king. Not so. They were not thrilled at all, and they essentially tried to block him in many ways. And one of the interesting ways in which they tried to block him was by telling him, we have a tradition. If a man wants to marry one of our daughters, he has to come barefoot to our house, and he has to light a fire in our kitchen by himself. Think about it, a wood fire. Thinking that, of course, the king is never going to agree to such a condition. Well, guess what? He goes barefoot to their house, he lights a fire. And that's how he gets married to Bibi Mora. Now, the Akal Takht was, even in those times, sort of the very visible seat of temporal power within the Sikh faith. And the person heading it was a very colorful character that I write about in the book as well, His name was Akali Fulla Singh, larger than life, fought many battles, but never really looked at Ranjit Singh as his king. You know, a story goes that one day Ranjit Singh was traveling in a royal procession, sitting on an elephant, and Akali Fulla Singh was sitting in a tower, and he calls forth to the king. So Ranjit Singh was blind in one eye because he had contracted smallpox, when he was a child. So I'll say this in Punjabi first. So he shouts out, "Oi kaaniya, chuhe te baith ke kithe challe hain?" And Ranjit Singh, with a sense of humor, just for everyone I'll translate, he says, "Oh, you one-eyed man, where are you going riding on this mouse?" So Ranjit Singh, of course, understanding the personality of Akali Fulla Singh, just smiles and bows and says, "Whatever I have, it's bequeathed by you." So Akali Fulla Singh is incensed. The king, first of all, as a practicing Sikh, he's not supposed to have multiple wives, and now he wants to marry a Muslim courtesan? I mean, what nonsense. So there are deliberations at the Akal Takht, and a decision is made that Ranjit Singh has transgressed, and he has to be punished. And the punishment that's awarded is that he's going to get lashes, he's going to be lashed. So Ranjit Singh is told of the punishment, and he bows down and says, "Fine. If that's what the Akal Takht says, that's what I'm going to do." Well, Akali Fulla Singh is so pleased by that he lets him go with one lash. And that's how Ranjit Singh is able to bring Mora into his harem. Now, the story doesn't end there. She continues to be his favorite wife for years and years and years. And there are references to Bibi Mora in Sohanlal Suri's account as well, and the accounts of several foreign travelers who visited the court who talk about the affection and regard that he held her in.
There's another aspect in your book which I found a little surprising, because Sikhs were not supposed to practice sati or
Yes.
to condone it. Yet, throughout the empire, whenever the Maharajas died, the queens and some slave girls, so-called slave girls, they committed sati with him. How did this come about?
Indeed. So some of the, a couple of the very poignant accounts that I came across in my research talked about the demise of his Rajput wives after he died. So you're exactly right. The Sikh faith explicitly prohibited the practice of sati. The third Sikh Guru, Guru Amar Das, absolutely rejected it unequivocally, and Sikhs were not supposed to practice it at all. So Ranjit Singh, I'll have to give you a little bit of context. Ranjit Singh was at odds with Raja Sansar Chand of Kangra, who came from a proud family which had ruled unbroken for 900 years. So this was the bluest of the blue bloods. And through a strange set of circumstances, Ranjit Singh took two of Sansar Chand's daughters into his harem. So one of the daughters, the surviving queen, is the one who committed sati with some of the other queens and slave girls in attendance. And in all my research, there was nothing that I found that suggested that they were expected to do it, they were pressured to do it. Far from it, because Ranjit Singh was a Sikh, and he was a devout Sikh, his peccadillos notwithstanding. But from the accounts, it's very clear that the queens did this voluntarily. And Martin Honigberger, who was Ranjit Singh's physician and also in charge of his gunpowder factory, quite interestingly, was present at the occasion, and he provides a very riveting account of what had occurred, which is in the book.
And all the Maharajas and Rajas who came after him, on their death also their wives and concubines.
I have found some references to that. Very explicitly when Raja Dhyan Singh Dogra died. Of course, Raja Dhyan Singh Dogra was not quote unquote a Sikh, he was a Hindu, but he was very close to Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and at that time a lot of the courtiers, including a lot of his foreign courtiers, had for all practical intents and purposes become quote unquote Sikh after a fashion. But I did find references to sati after Raja Dhyan Singh Dogra was killed as well. So there have been a few things that I found in my research.
Sikh history has told us that Maharaja Ranjit Singh was this benevolent, kind, great Maharaja who dealt very well with his enemies. But some of the battles that he won show us that he did also practice cruelty on the field. I mean, he took the women of his foes, he looted them, brought back all the wealth from there. Exactly what the Afghans were accused of doing.
Indeed. So, in my book, I present a very unvarnished history of the times, and it's important to understand history in all of its complexities. War is ugly business, always. War in medieval times was particularly ugly. No matter what ideological twist one puts on it, the fact of the matter remains that when men went to war in those days, the primary purpose was plunder and enrichment. And yes, there was definitely some of that in some of the campaigns. Particularly Afghan sources talk about the sack of Peshawar by Ranjit Singh's armies. So it was definitely an artifact of the times, and while it may make us uncomfortable, it's important to acknowledge what went on in those days. That said, historical empathy is tremendously important when we study the past, and Ranjit Singh has to be placed in the context of not today's world, not that there are any shortages of barbarous behavior in today's world, but we have to put his reign and his outlook as a king in the context of his times. And by the way, these are not Sikh sources who write this, these are all sources. According to all sources, he was a very benevolent ruler. His empire was a meritocracy. Even though he was a Sikh, it was not a Sikh court. His foreign minister was Muslim. Several of his generals were Hindus as well as Sikhs. A lot of his administrators were Hindus. And then in the latter part of his career, some of his most important military leaders were foreigners. You know, there were Frenchmen, there were Germans, there were Englishmen and Scotsmen. There was even an American who gives us the title character, gives us the title of the book. The Camel Merchant of Philadelphia was Josiah Harlan, a Quaker from Philadelphia who became a provincial governor in Ranjit Singh's court. So it was a very secular court. You know, in today's times, there's a lot to learn from that. You know, in this country, we have, two mighty political parties, one of which uses secularism as a source of votes, and another which condemns secularism as it embraces chauvinism. I say a pox upon both their houses for doing this, and one should really look at instances in history, such as Ranjit Singh's court, where pragmatic secularism essentially means that you blind yourself to who anyone is and where they come from and focus on what they have to contribute. I think that is the most enduring legacy of Ranjit Singh's empire, and that's what we have to look at when we study history.
So this empire, we hear the bell, but a couple of
ominous
quick
bell.
questions. How did it go into a decline and then fall, and the British then took over the Punjab empire.
So that could keep us here for another hour. I'll try to give you the short
The
version.
short version of it.
Indeed.
Quick
indeed.
one.
So this is one of the most compelling aspects of the history of the empire. The tragedy that followed the death of Ranjit Singh can only be described as Shakespearean. I mean, seriously, if somebody tried to write a fictional account, it could not be more dramatic. So Ranjit Singh was succeeded by his eldest son, Courtesan, who was not even a shadow of his father's in terms of sheer capability, personal charisma, leadership capabilities. His son, Naunihal Singh, was very much like his grandfather and probably would have made a fabulous emperor, and he was, of course, the heir apparent. So Courtesan died a few years after Ranjit Singh's death, and in a really bizarre set of circumstances, as the young Naunihal Singh, who was the new Maharaja, was returning to the palace after cremating his father, one of the gates of the palace collapsed on top of him. And he was struck by a huge stone and he died. So that kind of killed the most capable successor in the king's line. His next son, Sher Singh, who was a very brave warrior and very well regarded by the military, was then next in line for the throne. But Khadak Singh's widow, Naunihal Singh's mother, Chand Kaur, decided to seek power, and intriguing with some of the courtiers, she declared herself as the Maharani. And then a bitter civil war was fought in which Sher Singh prevailed, and some semblance of order was brought back to the empire. But he was very treacherously assassinated by his cousins, the Sandavalia family, who came from the same lineage as Ranjit Singh and were intensely jealous. Remember, monarchy was alien to the Sikh ethos because the community had been very republican. You know, it was a meritocracy. The most able man rose to the front, and the notion of bowing before a king was absolutely alien to the Sikhs. So this translated into the treacherous assassination of Sher Singh. And during that assassination, Diwan Dhyan Singh Dogra, Ranjit Singh's prime minister, and also Sher Singh's prime minister, was also assassinated. So in one fell swoop, almost all the capable potential successors were killed through a bizarre set of circumstances. The British were staunch allies of Ranjit Singh. He had signed a treaty with them, and while he was alive, they absolutely respected his kingdom. After he died, they saw the anarchy unfolding and they stepped in to benefit from it. So we don't have time to get into the complex history of the two Anglo-Sikh wars. Suffice it to say that the British, true to form, were successful in reaching out to some of the courtiers and generals who were left in the court, bribed them, and got them to essentially defect and hold back. And thus, through treachery, the British were able to step in after the collapse of the Sikh Empire.
And the Kohinoor moved to the British.
Oh, the Kohinoor, yes indeed.
That's all the time we have, and thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure.